you ever wondered what your management group hierarchy looks like and what policy assignments are in place and where your RBAC assignments are and all the different bits and pieces of a governance overview in Azure looks like, without having to click through all of these different blades and starting drilling through the tree and clicking on details and working out where your RBAC assignments are, whether they're inherited, and then doing the same for your policies and working out where they're coming from. All of these different bits and pieces can become really complex in a large Azure environment, whether you're starting out or whether you've already got something out there and you just want to do a gather of all the information that's already deployed out there. Well, luckily, there's a tool for you out there that is free to the community, written by one of our senior customer engineers in Germany, Julian Hayward, and this is his repo that he has shared with the community called the AzGovViz, or the Azure Governance Visualizer tool, that's actually referenced in the CAF documentation. As we can see here under Resources and Tools and Templates, we can see the Azure Governance Visualizer here, and that will link you through to this repository of this tool. Now, this tool is fantastic. It's a simple PowerShell script that runs, and obviously that will take time depending on how large your environment is, but it will pull out lots of information. So here's one I ran in my environment earlier, and what we're going to show you is how to configure this in your environment with an Azure DevOps pipeline. But I'll just give you a quick overview of this tool. So as you can see, I've got my management group hierarchy listed out here and where my subscriptions are placed in here. I can get some quick insights saying there's custom policies and what policy assignments exist in my world, and I can filter these and do what I need, as you can see with this table here. I can also download those as CSVs if I wanted to as well, if I wanted to export that. And then if I clicked into, say, where I've got the subscription, it'll flash and tell me where it is in the tree. So if you didn't see that, look just below my mouse now, and you see that little red flash over nav prod. So if I click on nav prod, I can look in here and go, oh look, there's some policy assignments here, and they are inherited, I'd imagine. So yeah, 2 policy assignments inherited, and as you can see that it's inherited from landing zones. So one of them is deny public IP and one is deploy Azure Security Center standard, and you can see where the assignment lives, and you get all these quick details around whether it's deny, deploy if not exist, whether it's compliant or not, how many resources are non-compliant, all from a very quick snapshot from this tool. And best of all, this integrates with Azure DevOps wikis as well. So this is the same view, same hierarchy tree. Obviously not as good looking, but this is using the Mermaid plugin for Azure DevOps to present this view. And as you can see, I've got the same information about my hierarchy, where my subscriptions are linked, what the IDs of my management groups are, and a quick summary of all these things. So this is great for especially enterprise scale deployments, which my management group structure may look very familiar to you if you've looked at enterprise scale. But this is great for ratifying those changes, documenting as you go, and almost giving you a snapshot of your environment without having to go drill through the Azure portal every time. Also great to share with other people and senior execs if they're interested in what's going on in your Azure environment. So enough talking, let's get into how you actually configure and deploy this in an Azure DevOps world. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need to do is go and get the files that we need for the Azure DevOps pipeline to run and use, which is a PowerShell script that is in this repository. And also we need to get the YAML file for the pipeline as well, that we'll use to import into Azure DevOps to make our lives a little bit easier in the next couple of steps. So first of all, you need to browse to this repository, and that's really easy. So if you go to aka.ms/AzGovViz, and just browse to that. That will redirect you to the right location and the right repository. And then what you need to do is download this repository. So if we click on code here, and you can click download zip. Now, if you're comfortable with doing the git clone process and all of those bits, feel free to do that. So you've got the files locally, but I'm just going to show us a really easy way to get these files. So as you can see, that is now downloaded. And if I open that file and I export everything in here, so let's just do extract all, and let's just pop this on my desktop. So let's go desktop, and let's just call this, make a new folder, AzGovViz, and let's just extract it all into this folder and go. All right, so that's all extracted in here, and now you'll see we've got an exact clone of this repository. So I've also got VS Code open, and if you watched my previous video on how to set up Azure DevOps for Terraform, this is going to use the same repository for that. So if you want to go and check that out, I'll leave a link somewhere up here, but you can go and check that out later. What we're going to need to do now is actually open this in a file explorer. So if you right click in here in the navigation pane and click Reveal in File Explorer. It'll open up that location in your Git window, in your File Explorer. I'm just going to snap that to the side, although I've got my screen tooling on for a larger screen, so I won't do that. So we'll open up both of those folders. So I've got my Git repository here, and I've got my AzGovViz zip extraction that I've just downloaded here. And what we're going to need to do is copy this PowerShell folder and the file within it into my repository, and we need to keep that folder as is. So I'm just going to copy that, and we're going to paste that over here. And that is it for the PowerShell bit, and we also need to copy this pipeline file. Now you can choose to leave it in the pipeline file. I'm going to choose to take it out and just put it in the root of the repository. So again, I'm just going to go and grab that file, so click copy and paste that into the root of my repository and click paste. And that is it. So now if we go back in here into VS Code, you'll see that those two things now exist in this repository, and we need to commit these. Now I've got branch protection turned on, so I'm just going to need to create a new branch. So I'm just call this AzGovViz and pop them in there, and then I'm going to need to commit these changes into this new branch, and we can just call this initial upload, commit that, and then we can push this branch and those changes up to our repository. Okay, that's all done. We've got everything downloaded from the repo by downloading it and extracting it, and we've pushed the PowerShell file and the pipeline up into our Azure DevOps repository as per my previous video. And now we're going to get into how we go and configure a service principal that is needed for the pipeline to use. So I'll catch you in the next step. Okay, so here I am logged into Azure DevOps, and as per my video last week where we were setting up Terraform for Azure DevOps, we're going to do it in the same project and the same repository as I showed in the last step when uploading those files. So if we go into that project and we go into the repositories, and as we can see, here's our branch that we created as AzGovViz, and that is needing to be pulled into the main branch. So let's create a pull request and get that done, and let's just call this AzGovViz upload. We can just call this uploading required files for AzGovViz. We can hit create. And that's going to just go through our pull request process. But if we look in the files, it's adding the PowerShell folder and the AzGovViz PS1 file and our YAML pipeline. So all good, that's what we want. So I need to just approve that, and I'm going to say cool, approve and complete, and pop that into my main branch. And that's just completing now. Cool, so if we go back to our repo, and as you can see, we're in main now, and we've got our PowerShell file, and we've also got our YAML pipeline for the pipeline here as well. So what we now need to do is create a service principal for the AzGovViz tooling to use. Basically, that PowerShell script needs to use to scan your environment and check what's out there, your management group hierarchy, your RBAC assignments, your policy assignments, definitions, all of those governance bits that you'll want to discover. It's going to need permissions to do that. Now, it needs two sets of permissions. So it needs some Azure Active Directory API permissions, which I'll show you how to configure in a second. And it also needs reader RBAC permissions on the highest tree, so your tenant root group, so that it can scan everything beneath that. If you don't want it to scan everything beneath that, then you can scope it differently, but we're going to scope it to that very top level so it scans everything in our tenant in the Azure perspective. So let's go into my Azure environment, and let's go into Azure Active Directory, and let's create a new application or a new service principal. So let's call this, and we can call this JT AzGovViz demo SPN, and we can leave all of this as default and just hit register. I'm just going to copy the name of that service principal because we're going to need that later, and as per my last video, just going to create a notepad file here with all the details. So SPN name, and we're going to hit register. And great, that's created that. And we're going to copy out the client ID. So client ID, we're going to copy out the tenant ID. we're going to copy out the object ID. And we're going to need to get a secret. So let's go into certificates and secrets, new secret, and we'll call this secret 1. And we'll click add, and we're going to copy out the value of that secret there. And we'll just put secret. And again, just keeping this for temporary purposes. You could store this as an Azure Key Vault, as I showed you how to do last time in my other video. Or you could use the same service principal even, because that has the relevant permissions to scan over the entire repository, the entire tenant. But I think it's great to have a different, this principal is for this purpose. Create a separate principal, it can go and use that, and you know exactly what each principal is doing, instead of principals being used for this different purposes all across your environment and it getting a bit confusing. So we've got all those copied out, and now what we're going to do is give it some permissions. So first thing we need to do is give it some Azure Active Directory permissions. So if we go into API permissions and we do add a permission, and what we need to do is go into the Microsoft Graph, and we need to go into application permissions, and then we need to find one here which is a directory, and then we want to say directory read all, and we want to add that permission. And we also need to add another permission, and if you scroll down here into the legacy APIs, the Azure Active Directory Graph, and just go into application permission again, there's another one in here called directory read all again. So we're just going to add directory read all from the old API as well and add that one in, and that should be us. And then what we need to do is click this box here that says grant admin consent for my tenant for these principles. So we can say yes and yes, and now we should get some green ticks against those, and that's it from that side. Then what we also need to do is go and grant this service principal RBAC permissions at the relevant scope. So if I go into my management groups and I'm at my tenant root group and I hit details, and I'm logged in as an account that has permissions to grant permissions at the tenant root group, so make sure you're logged in as a user doing that. And I go into access control and IAM, and I go into role assignments and I click add, and let's do a role assignment, and we want to grant this reader. And it's my service principal that we just created, so JT AzGovViz Demo SPN, and there we go. We can hit save. So reader role at the tenant root level, and that is just going to go and grant that permission now. And as we can see, here it is, all good, and it's in place. So all looking good. We've got everything set up. From there, we've got our details for our service principal. What we now need to do is go into Azure DevOps and actually configure that service connection. So if we go into Azure DevOps and we go down into the bottom left-hand corner and click on project settings, or click on the cog, and then we need to scroll down to service connections, and we need to do a new service connection, and again it's Azure Resource Manager, and it's service principal manual because we just manually created it. And then what we need to say is, it searched for the Azure Public Cloud. It's scoped at the management group level, so we're going to need to go and grab my management group ID. So let's go and grab that while we're back here. So back into my management groups, on my tenant root group, and just grabbing the ID here. Grab its name, which is tenant root group, and right, service principal ID. So this is the client ID. We saved earlier, and the key is the secret, so we'll grab that and pop that in here, and the tenant ID, and we can hit verify to make sure that's all good. And as you can see, verification succeeded, so it's managed to log in at that scope and check it's all good. And we just need to give this a name, so we can call this AzGovViz demo SPN. Now we should also call this the same as what we gave it in Azure, just so that it keeps it nice and uniform. So I'll actually go and grab that name that we gave it earlier and pop that in there, and we can say yep, all good, verify and save. All right, so we've now got that SPN into Azure DevOps, and in the next step we'll show you how to configure that pipeline so that it can go and use this. Okay, so we've added our service principal into Azure DevOps as a service connection, and what we need to do is take its name, because we'll need that in the next step. So if you can just click onto the service connection and just grab its name and copy that to your clipboard. And then what we need to do is go and create that pipeline based upon that YAML file we uploaded into the repository earlier. So if we click onto pipelines and pipelines again, just in case you click on any of these options, and we say new pipeline, and now it's going to ask us where that YAML file is stored. So it's in our Azure repos Git repo, it's in our TF ASDO demo repository, and we have an existing Azure Pipelines YAML file, so we'll select that option. And if we drop this down, you can see it's found our YAML file that we uploaded earlier, so we can select that and click continue. And here we are, here's that file. Don't need to worry about every bit in this file. Effectively what this file does is it runs that PowerShell script in our PowerShell directory, and then it will log in as the service connection that we're going to give it, and it will scan all the management groups and your subscriptions and your policy assignments and definitions and all those bits and pieces from the governance perspective, and then it will create 3 files and put them in a folder in this repository called Wiki, and that will be the markdown file that we can use as in your Azure DevOps Wiki. It'll be a HTML file, and it'll also be a CSV file that you can use to export all the information and keep an eye on what's going on, and use that to build your own reports if you wanted to, or just use the built-in tooling that this gives you. So all we need to change in here is the sections in the variables. As you can see here, we've got one that's asking for our service connection name, so we can go into here, this line here, line 22, and we can just delete everything on that line and replace it with the name of our service connection, and make sure we keep all of the spacing in line and making sure it looks all uniform, because it's YAML, so the indents are really important, hence why we've got these dots here, and make sure we've got no extra lines or anything like that we don't need. We also need the management group ID, so I'm still in Azure, so I can go and grab that. So this is the management group ID of the management group you want it to start at and work down from. So I want to do it for my tenant because that's what we've given it permissions to, but you could scope yours differently. So I'm just going to copy the ID there. And again, just replace everything on the management group ID line with my management group ID. And then I don't really need to change anything else, to be perfectly honest. But I'll just walk you through what this does. So this is the directory that it's going to create if it doesn't exist already, and put your wiki files in. So those 3 files, the markdown, the HTML, and the CSV file. The CSV delimiter that we want to use, that's fine for us. The directory that the PowerShell file lives in, so we uploaded it into the PWSH folder earlier, and it is called AzGovViz.ps1, so we can leave that as default. This piece here tells it how often this pipeline should run. So this is a cron schedule, and that's saying every 12 hours, but you could change that if you wanted to. And then there's the other options here where you can say it's running on Ubuntu, and as you can see here, it's effectively going check if the wiki path exists. If it doesn't, create it, and it's going to go and install some PowerShell modules for the resource graph that it needs, and then it's going to go and run the AzGovViz tool and push it out to our repository. So that's all of that. We can click save here. We don't want to do a save and run just yet. We can do a save. And we need to put this in another branch because we've got branch policies turned on, so we can say create a new branch for this. So we can call this AzGovViz pipeline, and we can call this setup AzGovViz pipeline, and we can say start report request now to save that. So that's going to create a new branch, commit that to that branch, and then create a new pull request. So if we go back into our repo and we click on files, we're going to see a new branch in here called AzGovViz pipeline. What we need to do is pull that into our main branch. Sorry. So if we click on pull requests, you can see there's already this pull request has been created, and what we just need to do is approve it. But if we're just looking in the files quickly, all it's doing is adding this file with the changes that we just made to the pipeline when we created it. So we can say approve and complete and merge, and that's going to pop that back from the AzGovViz pipeline branch that we created as part of the pipeline wizard, and pop that back into our main branch. And that's all done. And if I now go back into files, and we're on the main branch, and I went into the AzGovViz YAML file, you'd see that those details are now filled out in here. Okay, so there's one more task that we need to do for the pipeline, and it's more to do with permissions on the repository, in fact. So what we need to actually do is go into the project settings again, Scroll down to repositories, click on this repository, and then go to permissions. Now we actually need to grant the pipeline agent service permissions itself to basically push those files back into our repository. Because we've got branch policies turned on as well, we're going to need to let it bypass our policies, otherwise it's going to fail every time because it doesn't create a pull request, etc. So what we need to do is search for the project collection build service. So or actually we can look for the one specific to this project. So if we go for TF AzDo demo, and you can see I've got this build service one here. So it's the name of my project and then build service after it. So if we select that one, and what we're going to need to do is set a couple of options here. So we want to say bypass policies when pushing, yes, because we don't want it to go through be subject to our branch policies. We also want to set it to allow to contribute as well. And that is effectively it. All we need to set there. And that will be enough for our pipeline to run. And now I suppose the only thing we've got left to do is actually to run that pipeline. So if we go back onto pipelines, and if we click on all up here because it hasn't run yet, and we can see that here, and we can click on that pipeline and click run pipeline. Leave this all as default and hit run. And hopefully, fingers crossed, if we configured everything correctly, this will now go and work. So let's click into the job and see what's going on, and we can watch this step through. Okay, so it's got an agent. It's just initializing the jobs, downloading the files. It's now doing some prereq, so it's making sure it's got a wiki directory, and if not, it will create it. It's installing the Azure Resource Graph PowerShell module because it uses that as part of the tooling to run and discover bits about your environment. And we can see it's now logging in to your Azure repository, and now it's starting to collect all these different bits of information. So it's checking some permissions first, and that looks all good, and now it's gathering all that information about your Azure environment. Now this can take some time, so I'll pause the video here and come back when that's finished. Okay, so we've actually got an error while that was running, and this is an error I received in my own environment. It's because I actually got this script does something where it returns a null value, as in there's nothing in my environment that it can scan and get output, and therefore it thinks it's a failure. So I'm going to show you how to fix that very quickly. So we need to go back into our pipeline. And we need to edit our pipeline. So if we go into our, it's actually this one here. I'll show you how to rename that as well because it's not too pretty and easy to identify. So if we click edit, and we're just going to rename this pipeline in a second. But let's first of all fix this issue. So it's actually on the run as AzGovViz task. And what we need to do is just need to change a little option here. So if you click on settings above line 57, and it's got this error action preference, and what we just need to say is just silently continue. Like we know that that's fine. It can fail. It's not a problem at all. And then what we just need to do is click add, and you'll see it'll add a few other little bits and pieces into here. But the most important line is this error action preference silently continue, and that's all we need it to do. And what we can now do is save this. Again, we need it to be in another branch. So I'm just going to call this update, or we'll call this fix for AzGovViz null value, and we'll call this AzGovViz fix. We'll hit save on that. And to rename this, we just need to go back to our pipelines, find the pipeline, and click on the three dots next to it, and hit rename. And we can just call this AzGovViz. And there we go, that's all renamed for us. Now we just need to complete that pull request. So if we go into repos and pull requests, we'll see that one here. And we just need to see what it's doing. So click on files. And as you can see, we're just adding a few bits and pieces in here. And we can set approve and complete. Push that back in. Check that that's just merging in now. Okay, that's completed. And now if we go back to our pipelines, we can rerun this pipeline. So we can click on AzGovViz, run pipeline, leave all the values as default and hit run. and that is off and running again. So again, this takes a little bit of time. I'll pause it here and I'll come back when that completes, hopefully this time. Okay, so we're one step closer. This time we completed the run AzGovViz step, which is the one that we tweaked in just the previous little section. So that completed. This time we had a failure on pushing to the repository.
Okay, so I'm editing the video and I'll cut to the chase. I actually went down a rabbit hole of thinking it was the permissions on the repository for the build service, and I went back in and out of that settings blade probably another 3 or 4 times. Actually, it turns out it was the name of my branch. The script was looking for the name of my default branch in my Git repository to be master, but actually I created this repository pretty recently, so it's actually called main, and that's where a lot of my issues led. So instead of you seeing me go in and out of the permissions blade 3 or 4 times and rerun the pipeline, see it fail, I'm just going to cut to the chase and show you how I renamed or changed the script to use main instead of master. So I'll catch you back in the live edit.
Okay, so we've had a few failures still, and it's not actually permissions related now. We had all the right permissions in place. It's actually to do with the pipeline file itself. So if we go into files and the AzGovViz YAML pipeline, we need to actually edit the pipeline. So if we go into pipelines and we go to AzGovViz and do edit, we scroll all the way to the bottom, we'll see here that it's failing on the pushing step, and it's actually failing because it doesn't know where this is effectively. It doesn't know where my Git repository is, and that's because it's using head master, whereas actually my default branch is now main as per the default in Azure DevOps recently. I think that changed a few months ago. So I'm just going to change this from master to main. And I'm just going to do a quick find and look for any other references of master. Okay, so there's one there, so we'll change that to main as well. Okay, so there's no other references of master. And now what we're going to do is save that. Obviously, you're going to have to put it in a new branch as always, so we can call this as GovViz master fix to main. We'll copy that and we'll also call this as GovViz branch name fix, and we'll start a pull request. So back into our pull requests, got one here. We can go into the files and see what's going on. So those 2 changes we've made there, all we've changed is master to main, so we can approve that and complete the pull request and complete a merge. We'll wait for that to merge in. Okay, that's completed. So now if we just go back into here, we'd see that that's changed that file just now. Back into our pipelines and click on AzGovViz and hit run and run again. And hopefully this time it will now work. But now that is a good one to look out for. So if your branch or your default branch isn't called master, you might need to rename that. So keep an eye out for that one. Or if you've called it anything different apart from main, make sure you rename it to, as I've just done, to reflect what your main or your default branch is. Okay, I'll let that run and I'll report back, hopefully with it all working. Success, it worked. So that was our fix there. So make sure you've got permissions set for those 2 accounts, the build service account and one for the project and one for the pipeline itself. Make sure they're both allowed to contribute, and they're also allowed to contribute with ignoring branch policies, because that's what we've got set up in this environment and as we set up in our last video. But as you can now see, the push to AzGovViz output repository worked perfectly because it pushed to main instead of master. So if we now go back into our repo, we've now got a wiki directory that we didn't have before, and that has got 3 files in here, and they were all pushed by, if you look here, by the pipeline itself moments ago just now. So we've got one more step to finish off in Azure DevOps, and that's to configure the wiki. So if we go into overview and go into wiki, and then we can say, okay, there's not one here, but we say publish code as wiki because we have the code for it now. And we can select the folder where that wiki exists, which is in our wiki folder. And click OK. Give it a name, so we can call this AzGovViz and hit publish. And that will pick up the file that's in there, the markdown file. And there you go. There's the export of what our environment looks like and all the information that we had before that I showed right at the beginning. And if I was to now pull that repo down, I could also access the HTML file, which would show me the same report as we showed at the beginning, but that's just located in here. And as you can see, we've got a HTML file as well in here with all of that good information. And if I hit preview, that doesn't display too nicely inside of a frame, but when you download that and open that locally in your own browser, that works perfectly. So that's another good way of displaying that content. So I hope it's been useful. Give it a go, get testing out. Any questions, leave some notes in the comments, and yeah, get using this tool, because I think it's going to help you massively with your Azure governance experience and helping your customers understand what they've got deployed out there from a governance perspective, and also what that looks like over time, because this is all stored in Azure DevOps in a Git repo that's version controlled over time, so you'll be able to see how those change over time as well. So with that, thanks for watching, and catch you next time.